All right, let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second annual GRCC Peace Studies Conference. Very happy to have you all here. To give us a welcome, I would like to welcome to the podium the president of the college, Dr. Stephen Ender.
Well, welcome. Welcome. Do you have lunch today? Everybody's feeling okay out there? Energy in the room, some level would be good. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our institution for our second annual Peace and Reconciliation Conference. The program notes for me says that both the president of the college and the mayor of our town, George Hartwell, will deliver a welcome. And George isn't here yet, which is very unusual. I am very pleased because I hate to follow George. And the program was George and then the president. I thought, this is not going to go well for me. So he is either looking for a parking place or solving a city crisis because it's very unusual for him not to be here. It is my pleasure to greet you and to offer just a couple of insights about one, our college, and then second about the conference and some of the work that you'll be hearing and participating in the next several days. I continue to tell folks, both locally and across the state, and my colleagues across the country, that this institution, Grand Rapids Community College, and I have been a university guy for several years, 30-odd years. I was at big universities. We offer a university education with a community college philosophy. And I don't think it gets any better than that. In the work that Bob Hendershot and his faculty colleagues have done to bring this conference to our campus for its second year is just one example, I think, of what you find at this community college that is special and unique, and for our students, a real learning opportunity that I don't think you'll experience at many other community colleges in this country, and I'm just very proud that we do this work. And then the purpose of the conference, I was looking at this, and let me remind you that what Bob has promised us is that experts from around the country and throughout the world will come together to share their research and expertise related to international cooperation in crises, globalization, oppression, colonism, violent and nonviolent resistance, human rights, and the creation of sustainable peace. It's that last phrase that really caught my attention because I got to be honest, the first thing I said to myself was, well, that's an oxymoron. Sustainable peace. I mean, that sounds so wonderful, and I've never thought about sustainability in that way, quite frankly. And then that, of course, got my mind racing as to all the reasons why that's impossible, as I think about the world we live in. But that is a concept that I will invite all of us to think about during the next couple of days as we listen to this great array of speakers that we have here, because that should be our goal. And sustainable peace starts in our neighborhood, quite frankly, not just our world and on our campus and in our city. And how can we be part of a solution to, at times, what seems to be insurmountable problems between human beings? Because we do have responsibilities, I think, as citizens to engage in that work. So I am delighted that you're here. I'm confident that Bob and the faculty are going to deliver an outstanding 2 or 3 days of workshops for us. I think we're going to learn a lot, and we hope to see you here. Oh, and by the way, art prizes going on for those out-of-town guests, so when they give you a couple of minutes, you really should sneak out and see some of this wonderful art. That also is just another great event for our city. Thanks for being here. Really hope you enjoy your time with us.
Thank you, Dr. Ender. And yes, my name is Bob Hendershot. I teach world history here at the college, and it's my pleasure also to coordinate the events around the Peace Studies Conference. And I always like to mention, that things like this are possible because of many friendships that we have, throughout the community and more broadly as well. You've heard the the saying that all you have is your friends, and we're very fortunate in that we have many. I'd like to thank a few people in particular from the Grand Rapids Community College administration. Patty Tripkowski, right, where are you? Right in the back there, thank you very much. Dean Tripkowski. Also Rick Underheil, right, who should be here as well for his support and leadership. Lori Chesley and Steve Abid, other great leaders of the community. I'd also like to thank our partners at Ferris State University. I think we have a representative, Dr. David Pilgrim, right in the back. Ferris is our great partner for this endeavor, and I'll also note that everything that is going on here in the conference facility right over the next 3 days is also being streamed up to Big Rapids to Ferris State. And so the audience for these events is actually much larger than just those people here in this room. I'd also like to thank Reinhold Hill of Ferris as well. Our other partners and co-sponsors are the West Michigan Campaign for Love and Forgiveness, right under the grant leadership of Steve Chappell at Grand Valley State. And I'd also like to particularly thank the Woodruff Diversity Learning Center for all of their help and cooperation. Chris Arnold is a wonderful friend and a good partner to have, right, on issues of diversity and peace. Well, in terms of help for the conference, all of the organization and planning for this is really due to two people, Penny Wininger, who many of you who are coming in will have corresponded with already. Penny unfortunately couldn't be here today, but she sends you her best. And also Stacy Herrick, okay, who is running our registration desk outside there. I'd also like to thank the people who set up the ATC for all of these events, Becky Yoder and Baird, of course. And then my particular thanks to the Social Sciences Department here at the college. I have a great pleasure to work with some of the finest academics around. So particular thanks to our chair, Mike Light, who is here, I believe. There he is. Several of them have helped me incredibly with the conference. Gordon Varusic, right, who is here. Thank you very much, Gordon. And also Mike DeVivo. Okay, Susan Williams, Keith St. Clair, Heather Forrest, Gary Burbridge. It's a great pleasure to work with all of you. And it's a great pleasure to work here at the college where we have such wonderful support for events like this, which demonstrate the truth that academia is something of a mathematical anomaly in that it's far greater than the sum of its parts. A lot of the people presenting here over the next 3 days are wonderful academics in their own right, and they do brilliant work. But an academic conference such as this, where you bring these minds together into one room, where they can exchange their presentations and their work and ask questions of one another, leads to a far greater event. And this first panel is a wonderful example of that, right? Bringing together talented and dedicated scholars, right, to discuss their work. We'll begin the panel here just kind of seamlessly after this, and I'll ask the speakers to come up and join us here. And so, for example, right, the title of the panel is The Impact of International and Supranational Organizations in Africa. And our speakers come from very far away, in some cases. Dr. Theo Niedling, who will speak to us about peace and reconstruction and post-electoral DRC, right, the role of the United Nations, and future prospects. Right, comes to us from the Free State University in South Africa. Right, he just told me he had an 18-hour plane ride to be here with you this afternoon. And then one of our own as well, Gordon Varusic, right, from GRCC, and then Reverend Joshua Amanzichi, right, is on his way, and I'm told will be here momentarily. So, without further ado, please welcome our first couple of panelists, if you guys would come up here, and we'll get underway. You're up. Okay.
Thank you, Bob, Dr. Inderschot. It is really my privilege to be here. I must say it was indeed an 18-hour flight, but I made it, and yeah, thank you very much for the privilege. My paper is all about peace and reconstruction in the DRC, the role of MONUC and future prospects. Now, when I wrote this, it was still MONUC. Today, it is MONUSCO, because the UN recently changed the name, but I decided I'm going to stick with that paper. Now, I've got about 20 minutes to talk about the DRC in terms of the complexities of that country is extremely difficult. I'm going to try and give you a bird's eye view on this topic, the role of MONUC, the UN peacekeeping in the DRC, and some future prospects. I would like to start off by saying that many and very, very serious challenges continue to face the DRC in pursuit of its recovery, security, development, since we saw the historical elections in that country in 2006. But the situation in the DRC today remains very, very fragile. The peace process in the country is still at risk of unraveling. We see human rights violations still occurring on a very, very broad scale, and many of the political complexities in the country remain. Now, not so long ago, a UN mission to the DRC, a Security Council mission to the DRC, stated that the DRC remains one of the most complex and intricate environments ever faced by a peacekeeping mission. And I still think that is so true. In view of this, an announcement by the DRC government last year in September that the UN mission in the DRC will withdraw from the country caught many observers and role players off guard. After all, the role of MONUC, the UN mission in the DRC, has been so pivotal, has been so important in supporting the government of the country since 2006, since the election process, but also, in fact, since the end of the 1990s in that country. Why did they do that? Well, the DRC government's announcement coincided with pressure on the UN and the Security Council to come up with a plan for ending MONUC's work in the country in view of the country's 50th anniversary, which was in June this year, just recently. And in view of that, they were pressurized to come up with a plan for ending MONUC's work in the DRC. The structure of my paper is basically the following. I first of all focus on the post-electoral challenges in the DRC, where the establishment of peace and security, a stable environment, the assurance of economic recovery, all these things, where these things are still the ultimate goals and desired end state. Then I also focus in my paper on the intended withdrawal of MONUC, the UN mission in the DRC, and you can see it's got a new name, UN Organization Stabilization Stabilization Mission in the DRC, MONUSCO, since the 1st of July 2010. But in essence, it's still MONUC. And the most important question to me and many other people is the withdrawal of the UN from the DRC in 2011, next year, realistic? Furthermore, is that decision really best for the people of the country, or is withdrawal of UN peacekeepers from the country, and it's the biggest UN peacekeeping in the world nowadays, is that premature? So much money has been spent in that country from the side of the UN and also from my own country, South Africa, as part of the United Nations peacekeeping effort. I look at my paper in terms of the following. I'm just going to give you a broad outline because there's no time to really reflect on all of these things, but I focus on MONUC's context, the evolution of the mission in the DRC, the most pressing political security challenges remaining in the country, and specifically looking at the humanitarian situation and protection of civilians. I will say a few words about these things. The disarmament and demobilization of Congolese and foreign armed groups in the country and the process of building a new army. Then I also look at the eastern parts in the DRC, the territorial security issue, and especially relations between the DRC and Uganda and Rwanda on the other side. And I'm going to reflect finally on MONUC's intended withdrawal. The main thrust of my paper is really that second point. And I will focus on the humanitarian situation and protection of civilians, the whole process of disarmament, demobilization, repatriation, resettlement, and reintegration, which is an enormously difficult process to understand. Security sector reform simply meaning building a new army in the country, the regional context, and finally, if there is time left, democracy and the rule of law. These are serious challenges in the country. Now, from previous experience, I found that in Europe, for instance, people wouldn't know where to find the DRC, so I've got you a map. More or less in the middle of Africa, one of Africa's 3 big countries, geographically speaking, together with Sudan and Algeria. And there you can also see Uganda and Rwanda on the eastern side of the DRC, and that's been troubled, countries in trouble for various reasons in recent times. But let me go on immediately to the first challenge in the DRC given MONUC's withdrawal from the country, the humanitarian situation. What do we find there? Well, MONUC is going, but we can say that the humanitarian situation remains precarious due to large-scale population displacements, human rights violations by armed men, soldiers, including rapes, killings, lootings, and so forth. And these reports are coming in day by day or month by month. And furthermore, impeded humanitarian access and security incidents against the humanitarian workers. Well, one point of serious concern, of course, is the internally displaced persons in the DRC, and the figure was estimated recently by the UN Security Council to be about 2.2 million people, and of these, 1.7 million people were displaced in the troubled Kivu provinces in the eastern DRC. I got this photo recently from internally displaced persons in the DRC, and many people unfortunately live like this. Poor health conditions, dirty water, disease, and so forth. More than 2 million people are really battling like this man. Now, where's the problem? If you talk about the humanitarian situation, you find that the FARDC soldiers, that is the regular army. These soldiers are infamous for atrocities in the DRC where rape and pillaging seem to be elements in their everyday operations. In fact, the regular army is a source of instability instead of a source of stability, like you would find in the US, for instance, because the soldiers serve both public and private roles. During working hours, they serve in a public role as soldiers. After hours, they serve themselves, and they do as they wish, and that's the problem. No discipline, no doctrine that's keeping them together, no command systems. Also, the protection of civilians in the DRC and the humanitarian situation remain among the most pressing issues and challenges in the post-electoral period, that is 2006, especially the eastern parts of the country. Turning to another process, which is an enormously difficult process and which has been managed by the UN, DDR and DDRRR. That simply means you've got 2 processes that basically unfolded in the DRC, and I tried to unpack these things for myself, and I found that there is conventional so-called DDR, which simply means disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. I'll try to explain that furthermore. And then a process which is called disarmament, demobilization, repatriation, reintegration, and resettlement, or DDRRR. What does that mean? Well, these processes especially concerned the 2 most institutionalized militia groups in the region, and there are more than 20, by the way. But the 2 main ones are the FDLR and the CNDP, both operating in the eastern parts of the country. Now, what are they trying to do? The first group, as for them, the plan there is mainly based on integration into the regular armies. You're taking a militia group, you try to integrate them into the army. So not so much demobilization. Then there's another group, the FDLR, and the plan with them is basically to move them out of the country, back to Rwanda, where most of them are coming from, together with their dependents or offspring, the so-called genocidaries, people who fled Rwanda in 1994 with the genocide in Rwanda. So it's a regional thing. So on the one side, you're trying to integrate people into the regular army. On the other side, you're trying to move people out of the country. And you're talking about thousands of people. Very difficult. Security sector reform is one of the other... yeah, I think I should still share that with you, yeah. I just need to say that the war in the DRC resulted in dramatic changes in the social organization of the country. Both these two groups that I mentioned have established state-like institutions, tax collection systems, for instance. And the CNDP specifically has a tax collection system, and they basically replaced the formal Congolese authorities in many parts of the country. They also secured large stockpiles of weapons, and that makes them quite a serious enemy. Stockpiles of weapons, either through winning little wars against the regular army or through corrupt practices. The CNDP even developed into a truly global phenomenon because they operate globally with networks that extend throughout the world. They've got mineral resources, and that you need to export because you need to find markets. So they have done that. Another very, very serious problem in the country is that of security sector reform, and I know that the South African National Defence Force from my own country, South Africa, has been involved intimately in this, and that simply is incomplete when MONUC is now going. And we need to say that the incomplete integration of elements into the regular army and the challenges that had emerged in that regard were major factors affecting progress in the peace process, sustainable peace. Congolese soldiers and police officers often use arbitrary and excessive force in the country, and impunity against these actions remain, and we still keep seeing those reports. There is also widespread lack of law and order, which is exploited by these armed groups who no longer, we should say, pose a real threat to the sovereignty of the DRC, like 10 years ago, but who continue to loot the population, carry off natural resources, kill and rape. The one thing that did improve significantly in recent times is the regional context, because we saw some improved relations between the DRC on the one side and Rwanda and Uganda on the other side, which is in stark contrast to animosity during the late 1990s when the late Laurent Nkunda was still the ruler of the country. But when I say that, there is new trouble brewing apparently between Uganda and the DRC, and it's all about mineral resources and borders. We can say more about that. Okay, but MONUC is indeed going to withdraw from the country, and it is still, it should be viewed in against the background of the fact that President Kabila requested the UN to come up with a plan to end MONUC's work in the DRC. Now, at least some people say that's a good thing. One Western diplomat, for instance, said the following, and I think some people do think it's a good thing. It's partly a question of dignity. Kabila is eager to show that his government's reliance on UN peacekeepers is decreasing. It is understandable. No leader wants to give the impression that he needs UN peacekeepers to stay in power. Well, some people say it might imply that the DRC government now became convinced that its own forces would be up to the task of providing national security and forming a new army. But then experts in the field of peacekeeping will also tell you that a withdrawal of peacekeepers from the country is not going to be a swift task. It's going to take up to 2 years. And a hasty disengagement or dramatic reduction in peacekeepers could jeopardize the international community's work in the DRC over the past 10 years, and that again includes the work of, for instance, my own country, South Africa, in the DRC over many, many years. And huge investments have been made in that regard. But the long-term plan is indeed to move away from military peacekeepers to civilian peacekeepers who could attend to reconstruction, still trying to build the new army, fighting corruption, and so forth. But, and that's a big but, unless the DRC's claim to possess a reliable military force becomes a reality, this planned withdrawal of the UN by next year would be highly problematic. And the principal difficulty, I think, is still lying in governance, just visible government and governance in the East, especially the implementation of the security sector reform program, building that new army, and also still trying to get the repatriation process going well in terms of what has been planned by the UN and all the other role players. All right, I need to move towards the end of my presentation, and I would like to share a few notes in terms of my appraisal and concluding remarks with you. Well, MONUC faced some serious difficulties in recent times, but I think if you look at that theoretically speaking, I'm not going to go into that, you will find that MONUC has been built on a sound basis. That's my observation. But MONUC is going, and the question is still, where does that leave the DRC now in terms of peacekeeping after more than 10 years? Well, firstly, there are arguments in favor of MONUC's withdrawal. And those people are saying basically the following. They argue that it's a country largely at peace, that's the optimistic view, and ready to embark on the next critical phase, and the DRC government, therefore, they say, rightly put pressure on the UN to come up with a plan for for ending MONUC's work in the DRC. It is also said from this view that there has been progress in areas critical to the stabilization of the country, and that there have been significant gains against the FDLR, one of the two strong militia groups, and that relations between the DRC, Rwanda, and Uganda on the other side, DRC on the one side, Rwanda and Uganda on the other side, those relations improved significantly. And it is pointed out that the key reasons for this state of affairs are firstly improved ties between the DRC and neighbors, especially given the arrest of Tutsi rebel leader Laurent Nkunda, who really caused havoc over many, many years in the country. It's also argued that while there is still an estimated figure of more than 2 million people in the DRC in refugee camps, well, positively speaking, they say hundreds have been in a position to return home in recent years. And it's said, finally, from this angle, that now that the western parts of the country are more stable, more focus, energy, and resources could shift to the eastern parts. But then, very briefly, I would share with you some of the counter-arguments against what I've just said. It is often said that there are no clear indications that the DRC government has the ability on its own to implement the ongoing peace-building process and to head towards that magic word, sustainable peace. The building of the new army in terms of the process has advanced very slow and still going slowly. There's an urgent need to strengthen or advance the military integration process, also to professionalize the armed forces, the police and the military. It's also said from the skeptical side that many, many civilians, too many, remain vulnerable, displaced, and many continue to suffer immensely, which is true. Three final arguments from the side of those that are very skeptical about MONUC's withdrawal are the following. The justice system remains very weak. The courts and parliament lack capacity. Then they say, if you count the facts and figures, you find that plus minus 1,000 people die every day in the East, mainly due to disease, dirty water, and so forth. And you can point towards someone like Ross Mountain, who served as MONUC's deputy head at some point, who said at some point every 6 months, and think about that, it's an Asian tsunami. Therefore, it's too early to start pulling out the peacekeepers from the DRC. It's also said, finally, that older patterns of exploitation of national wealth are still driving elite politics and regional politics too, and that decades of mistrust between people require years of peace and progress to heal. My final point. Whatever is said about the DRC and about MONUC, MONUC is going to exit the country. There's been a political decision taken on that. And the DRC government opted to pursue an exit strategy and convinced the UN that it's the right thing to do, but it remains to be seen whether the DRC is ready and its government sufficiently strong and capacitated to embark on the next critical reconstruction and rebuilding phase. Now again, the two views. For the DRC government, the UN's withdrawal from the country will, in the words of one of its senior politicians, one of its ministers, will crown a job well done, and which had the great merit of helping us end a war that nearly wiped our nation off the map, quote unquote. But for others, and I tend to side with those, the withdrawal will be premature and a case of, in the words of one of my colleagues in Pretoria, South Africa, will be a case of mission unaccomplished. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to stop here. I trust that this was informative, that you learned a bit about the DRC, and yeah, thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Niedling. We'll follow the conference format here, and we have two more speakers on this panel, right? Each with their own 20-minute presentations, and then at the end we'll have some time for question and answer. And so please welcome our next panelist. It's Professor Gordan Verusic, Professor of Political Science here at Grand Rapids Community College.
Oh, okay. I was wondering what the third button is about. But about this one. No. All right. All right. I wish everybody a very good afternoon. Hope you're all doing well. I would like to thank Professor Henderson for giving me the opportunity to present my little research. That's a research in progress. Of course, all research is in progress all the time. And I hope to receive some good comments and questions from the audience so that this research can develop further. I have to say that this particular strain of research is not my invention. Since actually 2002, when Jan Manners, a scholar who studies European Union, he came up with this, on the surface, strange argument that something called European Union is an exceptional creature. I don't know, Americans have their exceptionalism, and then Europeans, I guess, also have their exceptionalism. So because European Union is an exceptional creature, and some cynical American scholar said, well, of course, it doesn't have any weapons, that's why it's exceptional. It has to pursue power by other means, rather than by weapons. So what are these other means that the European Union has? And then in the German theory of international relations, there's a whole bunch of people who think that part of these other means by which Europe can pursue power is the power of persuasion. And in the power of persuasion, ideally, all actors are equal. They're equal in their so-called objective power. What they differ in is in the strength of their arguments. So who wins in this game of power of persuasion? Well, the one who has the better or the best argument wins. If you're interested in that strain of research, Thomas Ries, a German international relations scholar, send me an email, I can send you the reference. However, it's not only about persuasion, but European Union has developed all kinds of instruments and techniques that is basically trying to make other countries what otherwise they wouldn't do. Classical definition of power. Power is the ability of an actor A to make actor B do what otherwise actor B would not do. So here I'm sort of trying to make this idealistic notion that European Union is a normative power, which and I will explain in more depth what it means. So here I'm trying to make this notion that Europe or European Union is trying to just persuade countries to do what otherwise they would not do I'm trying to make this notion problematic. I'm arguing, yes, sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. Right? And all science is just refinement of models. Right? We in science, even political science, although many people disagree that political science is science, right? But we are trying to follow great leads of natural scientists and try to refine our models. So I hope that this particular research that I'm pursuing will be part of refining this model. So understanding under what conditions this normative power works and under what conditions it doesn't. So that's a little bit of framework. And since there are many students here, and I know because I brought one of my classes, let me tell you a little bit what is European Union. Oops. Oh, okay. 27 countries. If somebody asks you what is European Union, the answer always says, well, it depends on whom you ask. I think the simplest answer is it's a group of 27 countries. But what does this group do? How this group is governed? Who has more power than the others? Right? That's all open to debate. European Union was, in 1951, called European Coal and Steel Community. It was established as a union of 6 countries to basically control the trade in coal and steel. Coal and steel were considered to be strategic raw materials for starting a war machine. And I think the basic purpose of creating coal and steel community in 1951 was to make sure that Germany never starts the Third War. Germany and France waged 3 wars against each other before 1951. So France wanted to make sure that Germany doesn't wage another war against it. And yes, France was one of the major powers, was the major power actually, behind the creation of European Coal and Steel Community. Today, this European Coal and Steel Community is called the European Union. It basically captures so-called several unions, right? One of them is monetary union, which means that 15 countries have a common currency called euro. They are single market, which basically means that at least theoretically, and I emphasize theoretically, shouldn't be any trade barriers between the countries themselves. And it also promotes the movement of capital, free movement of capital, which means that people can move money across national borders without control. It also promotes free movement of people within the European Union with some stipulations, with some obstacles for the newly minted European Union countries in Eastern Europe, with the exception of Slovenia. Slovenia never thought of itself as Eastern European country. They were over better than the rest of us, and I'm from Croatia, so I know. But free movement of people, free movement of capital, and free movement of goods and services. These are the main ideals of this union that captures together. There are 2 perspectives on understanding European Union. When I say 2 perspectives, I mean 2 theoretical perspectives. 2 ways in which political scientists understand how European Union works. So-called cynical intergovernmental perspective, which basically says that the only union that exists within the European Union is a trade union, free movement of goods, free movement of services, free movement of capital, and free movement of people. But there is no, according to intergovernmental perspective, these institutions that European Union has, such as European Commission, European Court of Justice, these institutions are not above the national institutions, the national interests. Right? Intergovernmentalists always think that interests of individual countries trump the interest of the Union as a whole. I was at the conference at Yale University in the audience, and there was a French trade minister there. And if there is a union, trade union, there shouldn't be a French trade minister. Why France wants to have a trade minister if there is only one single market? So I rose my hand and said, so what is your job? And he didn't want to respond. He just went to another question. But perhaps this gives some argument or some power of the argument for the intergovernmentalist. Supranational perspective, right? Supranational or supranational, regardless of how you want to call it, right? Supranationalists think that European Union is closer to being a federation rather than collection of semi-independent countries or confederation, right? They think that these institutions of the European Union, such as European Commission and the European Council, and especially European Court of Justice, really do matter, right? In the sense that they bring these countries together. And debate is long-going and long-standing. Well, because it brings a lot of money to the people who espouse each position, right? But these are the main theoretical perspectives by political scientists on what the European Union does. So what is this normative power? What is that? From one perspective, normative power is a process in which European Union wants to spread norms. So it's not like the United States. It goes to another country and says, we'll democratize or we'll shoot you. Right? It's supposed to be different, right? It's supposed to use other instruments than force. Right? It's supposed to use so-called non-coercive means, right? And we'll talk a little bit later what these non-coercive means are, right? But what are these core norms, right? Core norms are the respect of human rights. Right? And of course, there is a big debate, what are human rights? And I just recently talked to my students about human rights, and we were really struggling very hard to understand what the human rights are, where they're coming from. Some students said, well, they come from God. And I said, what if there's no God? And then, well, who told us that we have human rights? And we sort of agreed that human rights are culturally defined rights. What the community as such, as some political science theorists would say, what the community intersubjectively decides what rights humans in that particular community have. Right? So this notion about the fact that, that European Union wants to spread a certain notion of human rights is perceived as a sort of imperialistic. Who are you to tell us what human rights in our societies are? Right? Okay, we may agree that there is perhaps right to life and right to shelter, but about everything else, we disagree. Democracy. What on earth is democracy? Is that just enough to have elections, to have democracy? I think the civil wars in Bosnia and later in Iraq showed us, no, it's not enough to have elections, to have democracy. There must be certain norms, right? Such as equality of everybody before the law, such as restraint of government, such as resolution of conflicts by political means rather than violence, such as tolerance of others who are different from us, right? This is also democracy, right? And that part is also in countries who are of different cultures, non-Western countries. When the European Union goes there and wants to spread these norms, this is also perceived as something that is imperialistic, something that is not welcome necessarily in these particular societies. Rule of law, right? Environmental protection. The same story, especially environmental protection. If you go to, for example, if you go to Egypt these days, I have friends in Egypt who went there because they like the sights and sounds of the country. They like the deserts, they like the air, they like the sun. But many of these places, they were pristine maybe 15 or 20 years ago. Today, they're full of gated communities. And now my friends basically hear music from these gated communities instead of sights and sounds of the desert. So the whole country, developing countries want to develop. And if you say something about environmental protection in many developing countries, not China anymore, but in countries in North Africa, for example, they're looking strange at you because why would they care about environment when the West developed in environmentally unsustainable ways? Right? I read somewhere that Egyptian Minister of Development said, well, you guys are telling us about the environment. It's like the same thing, like you ate all the food and now you are inviting us to eat crumbs. Why would we protect environment? We want to develop. And sometimes this development is contradictory to environmental protection. Another perspective on normative power is that it is the ability to shape what is considered to be normal. Right? There is also some debate about that. What does it mean to be normal? I think some psychologists would tell you that normal is something that you internalize. So you internalize it in such a deep way that you act automatically. So if somebody walks around campus and tells you hi, it's probably normal for you to say hi back, right? You don't think about it. You don't make a rational decision. Oh, what's the cost and benefits of saying hi to that person? It's so internalized into you that you act automatically on it. I think that's perhaps the ultimate goal of normative power. Make these values so deeply internalized in society that they become part of your reflex behavior, right? Something that you don't have to think about, but you just do because you think, or you know, right, automatically that it's a good idea. Right? And normative power basically includes the notion of civilian power, right? Civilian power is an older concept, right? Civilian power came as a concept in the theory of political science before normative power came, right? I think the concept of civilian power wanted to a little bit lift up the so-called moral superiority of European Union as opposed to the preconceived notion that the United States resolves all the conflicts with using the military power. So by inventing the term of civilian power, European Union want to say we are better than you, right? Maybe you have the biggest hammer in the world, but not all problems are nails, right? We need basically to change that. So civilian power was the first notion in which European Union wanted to differentiate itself in comparison with the United States. So the notion of civilian power, which means persuasion without the use of force, is also part of this normative power concept. What are the processes in which normative power works? Right? Perhaps the most important process is the othering. Right? That's not my term. It's the term in theory. What does othering mean? Right? I think othering comes from something called social identity theory, from this notion that all of us like to be members of groups, that all of us need approvals of others. We cannot live alone, because if you live alone and if you don't have approval of others, we feel miserable. So the theory behind othering is that countries work like people, like individuals. That countries also like to be members of groups. That countries also need approval of others, especially others who have approval of many others. Approval of those who are perceived as special in international community. Right? So when you're going through the process of othering, what European Union is telling you, okay, you're not like us, you're other, right? You're different than we are, which in parlance of European Union means you are worse than we are, right? So if you want to be part of our group, if you want to play with our marbles, right, you want to become like we are, right? So Othering is this technique of persuasion. Come to us. Be like we are. Right? Don't be the other. Be us. Right? That's part of the normative power. Because if you are the other, you are not playing by the norms that we think are great. A process of securitarization, this is perhaps the most dangerous part of othering. If you are labeled by the European Union or by any other actor, by any other dominant actor in international relations, that you are a security threat. So it's not only that you are not playing by our norms, right? But you are threatening our well-being. You are threatening our survival and our security, like Iran, for example, right? That's securitization, and some theorists think that securitization can lead to military conflict. That's basically the essential driver behind military conflicts, right? Because if you are perceived by us as a security and threat, yes, we are going to take care that this security and threat disappears. And then the process of empowering, right? European Union recently tries to use its normative power, tries to basically create these norms in others by saying, you're our partner, right? Maybe you don't play by our rules, right? But let's think about it together. It's like marriage therapy. Let's do it together. It's not like we want you to do 1, 2, 3, right? But let's figure out together what you can do together with us so that you're not other anymore. In the old days, you would get, when you want to become a member of the European Union, you will get a 2,000-page book which tell you how to make your ice cream and how to create your government. All the rules were there, from ice cream making to government creation, right? But now it's a little bit different. Now it's about empowering. Now let's see what we can do together. What are the critiques? Of course, political science wouldn't be working if it was only if everybody agreed. Right? So Marxists are saying basically this concept of normative power is just a disguise for European Union to project its imperial power. Right? It's not really about democracy. It's not really about human rights. It's not really about the rule of law. And even if it is, the ultimate goal that the European Union has is the goal of exploitation, of taking the raw materials from the poor countries in order to basically use these raw materials in developed countries in order to improve the European economies. And neorealists are saying, well, maybe there is not even common power at all. Right? Maybe we cannot even talk about normative power, because if you talk about normative power, we talk about united European Union, and united European Union is impossible because each country pursues its own interest. So there is no normative power. As you can imagine, realists are very close to intergovernmental perspective that I talked about earlier. So is the European Union an effective normative power? I argue that there are 3 factors, or 3, as political scientists would call them, independent variables that can determine that. Compatibility of narratives, right? What does that mean? If European Union comes to a country and wants to impose the norms of democracy, human rights, rule of law, environmental protection, right? And this country thinks that these particular values are just a disguise for imperialist exploitation of the natural resources of that country, right? Then it is very difficult for the European Union to create normative power. Right? But if European Union comes to a country and says, okay, we want to impose these values, or we would like you to have societies based on these values, and this country thinks, oh, sure, I mean, we always belong to this European circle of values, but for example, because of communism for 40 or 50 years, we were away from this community, so we want to come back like a lost son. Right? Then normative power works better. Right? Another variable that I'm thinking about in terms of whether the European Union is effective normative power or not is the variable of interest of the European Union economic interest of the European Union and individual member states, right? Do these member states and the European Union as a whole, if there is such a thing, do they have economic and political interests, right, really, in having these values in these countries or in these regions? And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about briefly about case studies, right? And then, of course, interest of countries, domestic actors, right? Domestic actors in the countries, political parties, government, non-governmental organizations, all of them are basically thinking about how the entrance into the European Union or how the creation of these values in our society would influence them. So let me compare, oops, wrong button, right? Let me compare two cases very briefly, because we are running, I already run out of time, but just for a couple of minutes. let me compare two cases, right, of normative power, right? Perhaps the most successful imposition of normative power by the European Union was the enlargement of Eastern Europe, right? What are the narratives, right? The narratives between Eastern European countries and the European Union very compatible, right? European Union wants to basically impose all these values, rule of law, democracy, human rights, environmental protection, with a slight exception of environmental protection, right? All of these Eastern European countries thought they already deserve to be part of this community of values. And then this 50-year communism episode was just a blip on the radar. Right? They wanted to come back. They wanted to come back because Russia basically imposed values that they were not compatible with their societies, and therefore they wanted to come back in the circle of Western Europe. Right? EU interests, right? European Union wanted to have a very strong access, a close access to Eastern European markets. They wanted to have very strong access to highly educated Eastern European labor force, that could work high quality jobs at a fairly low price, right? And they also had security concerns, right? Russia. In Eastern Europe, we are still afraid of Russia. We are. You wouldn't believe it, but we are. So it was compatibility of security interest. Eastern Europeans wanted to get as far away from Russia as possible by getting into NATO and into basically protective community of values of the European Union, and European Union wanted to make sure that Eastern Europe never gets under Russian influence anymore. Right? And domestic actors are very interested in Eastern Europe in becoming members of the European Union for two basic reasons, right? Number one, every political party in Eastern Europe wants to be associated with the European Union. This is the sort of their legitimacy. Right? This is why people support them. It's political suicide in Eastern Europe if you say, well, I don't like European Union. Right? And then it's also transfer of responsibility. When Eastern European politicians said, well, it's not our fault. The European Union is asking us to do that. We are not responsible anymore. Right? What's happening in Africa? And Africa is a complicated case because for a long time it has been, for European Union, it has been sort of forgotten continent. Right? And Africa is basically trying to, oops, wrong again. Africa is trying basically to get into, at least to become a strong economic partner with the European Union, but they're also flirting with the Chinese and Indians and Brazilians at the same time. Right? The case, I think, good case of how normative power works in African context is something called Union for the Mediterranean. Right? That's part of so-called Barcelona process, and you can ask me questions about that later. Right, but as far as African narratives are concerned, Africa and European Union had two disparate narratives. Right? One narrative was, yes, you guys need to become members of this community of norms, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. But in Africa, many people and many politicians perceive that as a part of exploitation agenda. Right? As far as European interests are concerned, if you read the documents that are part of this Union for the Mediterranean, yes, these documents all talk about security and political partnerships, but the most important part is basically the creation of market incentives and business climate, which many analysts see as basically the attempt of the European Union to exploit the raw materials from these African countries and use them in their own economies. And then finally, domestic actors. Domestic actors wanted to have security protection of European Union, right? And they want to have the economic development. But they understand that European Union basically is not really interested in promoting democracy and promoting free society in North Africa, because short-term European Union politicians think that free societies with free movement of people and free movement of capital would create high immigration pressures on European countries. So in the short run, at least, this is not in European Union interest. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gordon. We have a third panelist right with us for this session, and it is Reverend Joshua Amazichi. Right, and so I will welcome him to the podium now for his presentation, and then of course we'll take questions for all three panelists following his period.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Hendrickson. You did so well in pronouncing my last name. It took me 2 years to learn to do that. And thanks to all of you for being here. When he asked me to present today, actually I brought a PowerPoint. Oh, great. Okay. Okay. So when he asked me to present today, and I went to the website and I saw a listing of all these great thinkers, I was a little bit intimidated. Professors, and I said anyway. I looked on the list and I saw Professor Virginia Beard, whom I have known, and that made me feel a little bit relaxed. Said, if great questions come my way, I'll push it to her. So I am here for the organization Pax Africana and to talk a little bit about what we do and present some of our common sense strategies for promoting peace in Africa. Pax Africana is an organization formed to promote peace in Africa using three key strategies. One is education, the other is community development, and then the other is advocacy. Now, the central focus of our work is the people. It's like a people-driven movement. As some of you already know, in every African country, you find different ethnic groups, organizations of ethnic groups. And behind this gathering together of ethnic groups is an unconscious preparation for war, an unconscious preparation for conflict. So what we are doing as an organization is to go into these countries of Africa and help the people form a multi-ethnic, people-driven movement for peace, an organization that brings the people together. We have begun our work in Liberia. We have also started our work in Kenya. Our vision is in the future to get to as many African countries as possible. As we go into the discussion of this theme, I would like to mention that we are a Christian organization. So in the course of talking about some of these strategies, you might hear some terms that are very closely tied to the Christian community. So please bear with us. I grant you the freedom to rename any concept that we introduce here, whichever way you want, and we'll be glad to have an ongoing conversation on any aspect of the strategy we have. Our mission is the peace of Africa. We would like to discuss with you on that. As many of us already would know, most disputes in Africa begin in the border areas. Most of them are related to land. Yes, most of them are related to land. Some of them are created by conditions before the era of colonialism. Some of them are created by conditions during the time of colonialism. Some of them are even created by conditions that existed during the post-colonial era. Now, the pattern had been that as people moved and conflicts led to movement of lands from one community to the other, there is always controversy over land in the border area. Even during the post-colonial era, most governments didn't do enough study in demarcating the borders of local government areas or counties, as we call it here. And the result is that there are conflicts between some of these newly created communities in their border areas. Another aspect of border situation in Africa that creates the potential for conflict is what happened during the partitioning of Africa. We found a situation where an ethnic group is divided into two. One part of the ethnic group becomes majority in one country and becomes minority in the other. So that kind of creates potential for conflict in most of Africa. So there is the fear of domination, which is also another source of conflict. There is the vengeance. Some of you remember the Rwandan story, what happened in Burundi in 1972. Many Hutus killed in Burundi, maybe close to 100,000 of them in 1972, leading to the Rwandan genocide in 1994. So the problem of vengeance, ethnic vengeance, is also another source of conflict. There is a relationship between these problems. So as an organization, we have spent some time reflecting on these, and we came up with a number of strategies that we believe will begin to deal with some of these problems. Now, one of the strategies is what we call the Frontiers Development Strategy. But in the course of my discussion today, I'm going to look at the approaches that we have from three perspectives. One is the development approach, where I'm going to talk about the Frontiers Development Strategy, and the other is the national approach, where I'm going to talk about what the nations in Africa themselves could do in addressing one area, one aspect of the causes of conflict. And then the other is the foreign policy approach. There I'm going to be talking about what the United States and the international community could do to respond to the African situation. Now, the concept of the Frontiers Development Strategy is that shared economic and infrastructural interests between two communities or two nations could be an incentive for getting them to commit to peace, could be an incentive for promoting peace between them in their border areas. In a sense, it means using development to promote peace. Using development to promote peace. There are four purposes that we have for that strategy. One is to prevent violent conflicts. Now, how this strategy works is that we come to these ethnic groups and say, instead of fighting over this land in your border area, we can set up a project or a business or some kind of investment that will mutually benefit both of you in that area of dispute, so long as you commit to a 20-year treaty of peace and submit to a mediation structure that we would put in place during that period. So one of the purposes is to prevent violent conflicts. Another is to restore interethnic trust. Another is to promote sustainable development, because if there is no peace, there can't be sustainable development. People will make one step forward and maybe two steps backward. And another purpose is to engender cooperation. So we developed three models that we use in pursuing this strategy. Now, one of them we call the Trinitarian model. In developing our model, we looked at God. How does God function, within the Godhead? As Christians, we think about God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, and yet they are one. So we looked at the theology of God in developing our strategy. So we came up with the Trinitarian model. Now, the Trinitarian model is a model that we can use to deal with conflicts that involve three communities that have a common border. Now, in that picture, you will see that the green, there is the area where the three of them come together. That's the area we call the development zone, and that's where we would invest our resources as we move them on the line of peace. Another strategy we have is the incarnation model. The incarnation model involves two communities or two nations at conflict. We can come to them and say, instead of fighting over your borders, that we can set up a project or an investment that will be beneficial to both of you in that area, so long as you commit to non-aggression in that area over a 20-year period. We look at 20 years because that will give us some time to do education, to work with the people, train and make the people desensitized to violence and war. Now, we have the common grace model. Common grace derives from the idea that God lets the rain fall on everybody, and the righteous and the unrighteous. So that's where we got this common grace model. And the idea is that we can set up, small projects that are dependent on a bigger project, on the basis of which we can get as many communities as possible, to commit to peace in a particular region. So here we have, the big, project. It could be a major hospital, or it could be a big, water production plant. And then we have the satellite projects in the small communities, that commit to our peace treaty. So these are the models that we use in that strategy. And as an organization, we don't reinvent the wheel, which means we don't go building hospitals or clinics or even providing water, but rather we partner with organizations that are already doing these things in Africa. And we tell them, look, we can work with you and use what you're already doing, to promote in the region where you are. So communities that commit to our strategy, we provide us an opportunity to bring in these organizations that are already working in Africa to invest in their border area. In doing this, the borders will be transformed from frontiers of conflicts to frontiers of peace and development. And if you follow the trend of conflicts and wars in Africa, the African leader, for example, will say that we will fight till the last man, and he is the last man. And he makes that pronouncement because he is in a walled city, in the capital city. Meanwhile, wars go on in the border areas. So we felt that if we can secure the borders for peace, even between nations, that we can promote peace in a region in Africa over a long period of time. We also felt that the same can be achieved at community, local level. That's why that strategy is also named, border area development strategy or borderline development strategy at community level. Now, I must say that in the implementation of our projects with regards to that strategy, that the people themselves are involved. We get the people to be involved physically and financially so that they can own up the project. And we make them part of the mediation structure that we put in place. Another common sense strategy that we looked at is the national buyback and reinvestment strategy. Now, this strategy has a purpose of resolving conflicts due to historical injustices as evidenced in land seizures or unjust reallocation of land. For example, in Zimbabwe and in Kenya. Now, it is always unjust to deprive people of their means of livelihood, whether that is done 100 years ago or is done today. So the question that we have to answer is, how can we ensure a win-win, both for victims of historical injustice and for the beneficiaries? How can we for Zimbabwe, for example, how could the Zimbabwean government have handled the issue of land in Zimbabwe in such a way, that farmers and agriculturists who are making a living through this land, stayed in their land and continued their businesses, while at the same time the victims, are also provided opportunities for growth and development. That way it becomes a win-win and everybody makes progress. So we come up with this national buyback and reinvestment strategy. And what this involves is that the government of the nation, for example, in Kenya, rather than the government waiting until the people of Kenya, whose land were taken by the Kikuyus, rise up against the Kikuyus, and there is an ethnic conflict that goes on that may result in a bigger war, the government can take some of these steps under that strategy. One of them is that the government has to acknowledge that there is a problem. And the government has to also acknowledge that all parties have a right to a good future. That is very, very important. One of the errors that we have committed as humanity in history is to say it didn't happen and to pretend that there is no problem and find excuses, to continue the way things are going. But it's very, very important, that we acknowledge where problem exists and that we acknowledge that every human being today is created in the image of God. That's a Christian language. But I would want to say that every human being has a right to good life and a future. And then the government needs to assess the current value of this land or the estate in dispute, that the government can go beyond that to set up a national trust fund in their budget to the value of the amount of the land that is in dispute. Now, this trust fund will be managed by a joint commission of the government and the people who were the victims or people who were deprived as a result of the historical situation. Now, this is not a kind of a Christmas gift, for the people. This is a reinvestment, program of the government. So what that means is that funds will be given out, to these people who lost out in the past on the basis of business or investment proposals, that they send to the trust fund. So this presupposes a lot of training and monitoring that has to go on. Part of what we had thought about is that benefits from this fund will go out to the beneficiaries as a loan. But that if the beneficiary shows efficient management, systems or efficient management approaches, and there is a success story, then the loan can be written off under the fund. But if the beneficiary uses it to marry more wives, then he can even go to jail for it under that strategy. Because the sense is not that people just get what they lost, but that they use it for the good of the people, that they can make progress into the future. Now, the last part I said about going to jail was probably an extreme of it, but the point there is that this is not a gift to the people, but an opportunity for them to find a new source of growth, a new source of investment as they move into the future. Now, the last point I would like to talk about is the foreign policy approach. We, as an organization, are proposing that every foreign aid to Africa be contingent on a commitment to peace. And this commitment to peace will be seen in the freedom of press, free and fair election, freedom of worship. One other thing we would have loved to add is the issue of having the ethnic communities come together to discuss how to live together as a people. A second part of the foreign policy approach is what we called the trinational foreign policy for Africa. Now, what do we mean by trinational foreign policy? We mean that rather than US, for example, having a different foreign policy for Uganda and a different foreign policy for DRC, for example, that they can have one foreign policy for those two countries based on the frontiers development strategy. What that means is that the US, will build its embassies in the border areas, that the U.S. and the nations under that policy will commit to non-aggression in their border area over a 20-year period. Now, the nations might lose a little bit of their sovereignty in this process, but the fact is that the condition of crisis in Africa requires some radical measures if some kind of sustainable peace is going to happen in some regions. Like the DRC, the conflict in DRC has come to a point where there is the Rwandan interest in DRC, there's the Ugandan interest in DRC. So how do we bring all this to a point where there could be resolution? So that's why we are recommending the trinational foreign policy for nations that had experienced long-term wars based on development and investment in their frontiers, in their border areas, based on a commitment to non-aggression in that area. That strategy can be used in Congo, Sudan. Of course, it's going to be useful in Liberia. For example, the nation of Liberia and Sierra Leone and the United States can have a common foreign policy instrument based on a commitment to peace in the border of Sierra Leone and Liberia over a 20-year period. So these are some of the common sense strategies that we came up with. We didn't come up with these strategies because we're experts in political science or international relations, but they are strategies we believe that will bear fruit if applied to the African situation. But God blessed our board too with people with expertise in some of these areas, and we explore their expertise and advice in the development of our work. So thank you, all of you, for listening. And thank you for inviting us.
I should also say that Pax Africana has a table set up out there in the lobby. Now, we do have a few minutes left, and I wanted to, now that our panelists are back together here, we have a few minutes to take questions. So please, we have the microphone, and I'll pass it around to any of you with a question, please.
I'd like to ask Dr. Needland, it's a good presentation, but I wanted to know, from what you see, you mentioned the repatriation strategy in Congo. Do you see Rwanda cooperating with that strategy? Because as I understood it, you said a lot of the FDLR were the former genocide heirs, and from the genocide of 93, 94, and were they going to welcome them back? Were they going to try to, continue to keep their trouble in the Congo?
Want me to answer straight away? Please. Yes, Rwanda has been very cooperative. That's the interesting thing. Rwanda, in fact, cooperated with the DRC government in repatriating some of the ex-genocidaries to Rwanda. There were joint operations, in fact, and that's actually quite remarkable if you take the relations in the region in the past couple of years. But the repatriation process is really a difficult one, given the fact that the people are returning. You've got so many groups that have got vested interest in especially issues pertaining to mineral wealth and mining and these things. So people are returning because what are you going to do in Rwanda? You've got vested interest and you've got mineral resources in the DRC. You don't just want to give up on that, and that's the problem. So the problem has not so much been the Rwanda government, but rather the issue of mineral resources and access to that.
I would like to ask the third speaker, Reverend, I'm not going to try and pronounce your surname. It seems there's something going on about it. But I want to ask you, in terms of I want to call it the proposition or even the thesis that you forwarded in terms of Africa, my assumption is that you very strongly suppose that you speak to the state, and that states are the actors that run the show in these areas. I have a different view of this in the sense that the real problem that you have in so many of the African countries and where you have these disputes are the numerous actors that are involved, of which the government might be one of the actors, and in too many cases they are not even the dominant actor. So who do you speak to? Who do you sell these, let's call it strategies? Who do you sell it to? Because the great difficulty is a party that does not agree with what you suggest, that can gather 100 men or women or children, 100 AKs, 1 tank and 10 RPGs, they upset the whole process. So who do you really sell the concept to?
That's a good question. Basically, the situation in Africa is something that requires a kind of a multi-approach. Now, the recommendation we have for a trinational foreign policy, for example, we have recommended to President Obama and his foreign policy team to look at as a possibility. And then the Frontiers Development Strategy, we talk to the leaders of the local communities, depending on where at which level this conflict exists. I must confess that we are a young organization, about 3 years, and some of the strategies are still at the level of concept, in the sense that we are trying them out. We are still getting the partnerships that are essential, for practicalizing some of the strategies. But some of them, like the national buyback and reinvestment strategy, is something Kenya can employ even today. I don't know exactly where Zimbabwe is in their own situation, but that's certainly something Mugabe would have looked at if perhaps he had that proposition 4 or 5 years ago. So there are different levels that our strategies can be employed in terms of which leader to meet and that kind of situation. We were in Liberia and we met with the foreign policy, or rather the foreign minister of Liberia, and we talked about the Frontiers Development Strategy and the possibility of having that understanding between Liberia and Sierra Leone, for example, in their border area. And she was very open to that. She was. And our hope is that when we have a similar meeting with the foreign policy or the foreign minister in Sierra Leone, and there is a common understanding about how the strategy works, we can then begin to think about how do we make that strategy bear fruit in the border of Sierra Leone and Liberia so that we can stem conflict in that region over a 20-year period. So that will be my brief answer to that question, but it's something I'll continue to think about. Thank you.
Well, we're about out of time, but I wanted to say thank you once again to all 3 of our excellent panelists. Thank you again for your time and for your expertise. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the conference will take a 15-minute break, and then we will reconvene in this room at 1:15 to hear our first keynote speaker, Dr. Karen Devine from Dublin City University, continue to explore these topics on the European Union and its security and defense policy. So please join us back here again at 3:15.